Hello, everyone. Welcome to, again, first Monday of 6th block. My name is Liz Lilly. I am the president for the Blue Key Honor Society this year, and we're really proud to help organize and advertise all of these First Monday events. There's a lot of work that goes into them, so we hope you appreciate them. So today, thanks to the Political Science Department and the William Jovanovich Endowment for Public Lectures, I have the honor of introducing Erica Chenoweth, who will be speaking today about civil resistance and why it works. So the William Jovanovich Endowment was established by Dr. Paul Brandwein in 1978 to honor his close personal friend and business associate, William Jovanovich. He passed away in 2001, and he was a distinguished publisher, author, and editor. Mr. Jovanovich was elected president of the Harcourt Brace and Company in 1954, and he transformed it into one of the nation's leading textbook publishers. And throughout his career, he championed the social importance of education, scholarship, and literature, and received an honorary degree from Colorado College in 1966. The Jovanovich Endowment has brought to Colorado College and the community of Colorado Springs many statesmen, writers, and educators known for their contributions in thought and action. And recent Jovanovich lectures have been given by Ezra Klein, John Mearsheimer, Ralph Nader, and Nate Silver. So you might remember Ralph Nader from one of our previous First Monday lecture series a couple years ago. So now a little bit about Erica Chenoweth. She's an associate professor at the Josef Korbel School of International Studies at the University of Denver, and she's an associate senior researcher at the Peace Research Institute of Oslo. In the past, she's also been a professor at Wesleyan University. Among many of her other accomplishments, Foreign Policy magazine has ranked her among the top 100 global thinkers in 2013. And she won the 2013 Grawemeyer Award for Ideas Improving World Order, which recognizes outstanding proposals that are dedicated towards creating a more just and peaceful world order. She's the co-author of Why Civil Resistance Works, The Strategic Logic of Nonviolent Conflict, which also won the 2012 Woodrow Wilson Foundation Award, which is given annually by the American Political Science Association. She's currently working on another book. It's tentatively titled Why Democracy Encourages Terrorism, which is investigating why non-state actors utilize violence in democracies rather than legal methods of protests. For fun, like many other CC students, she loves to spend her free time hiking in the Rocky Mountains, fly fishing, skiing, you name it. She's a Colorado native person. So today, this first Monday, we're going to be talking a little bit more about the following questions. How do you actually challenge the system that you're in? Why do state and non-state groups use political violence? And instead, why does civil resistance actually work? And more specifically, how can people use strategic non-violence to get what they want? And how can this be promoted? So without further ado, let's give a warm welcome to Erica Chenoweth.
All right. Well, good morning. Me here. I'm really pleased to be with you here at Colorado College. My secret is not so secret, but I was a PhD student at the University of Colorado at Boulder when I was invited by your very own John Gould to a workshop here at CC in 2006. It was called People, Power, and Pedagogy. And it was put on by the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict in collaboration with John. And what they were trying to do is get political scientists to familiarize themselves with the canon on strategic nonviolent conflict, and for us to sort of take it seriously and start teaching it in the classroom. And I came down here and I was a super skeptic, not just skeptical, but a super skeptic about the material. I thought that people who promoted the idea that nonviolent resistance could be effective were hopelessly naive, probably ideologically committed to pacifism, and that they were promoting a dangerous idea in many contexts. And so I sat in the room and kind of blasted people as they got up and talked about these ideas. And in the end, this woman named Maria Stefan came up to me and said, if you're so right about all these claims, why don't you demonstrate it empirically? So, given the double dog dare challenge of academia, we got together and collected some data, and it turned out that I was the person who was wrong, and that, in fact, the people that were arguing that nonviolent resistance was effective were actually making some pretty good points. So with all that said, as a prelude, I'll just say that notwithstanding DU's rivalry with CC vis-a-vis hockey, I do have a kind of warm, fuzzy feeling for this place because it rocketed me into a totally other dimension of scholarship that I had never been exposed to before. Thanks, John. So that said, I just want to develop these ideas a little bit further in terms of what I was thinking when I was thinking that nonviolent resistance couldn't work. And I'm going to mention these as common claims. They were the major reservations that I had myself when I was at this workshop, and I hear them repeated all the time in the mainstream media, among policymakers, among activists, you name it. So what I was thinking was that, first of all, nonviolent resistance isn't going to work if people are facing a very powerful, repressive, authoritarian regime. That when a leader is willing to use massive violence against unarmed people, that there's no chance that nonviolent resistance can succeed under those circumstances. And when I say nonviolent resistance or civil resistance, what I mean is a method of active conflict where unarmed civilians are actually confronting their opponent using a variety of tactics like protests, strikes, boycotts, demonstrations. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of different methods or techniques of nonviolent action that have been documented over the years. They're very context-specific. They're highly related to the conditions under which these people are living, and they have deep social resonance in many of these contexts. And my view was that, if people are doing this, generally symbolic types of actions, that they're putting themselves in harm's way in conditions where there's a high degree of repression. The second thing that I thought is that nonviolent resistance might work if what you're aiming at is reformist goals. So things like the expansion of civil rights, gender rights, economic rights, environmental justice, things like that. But if you're trying to actually unseat an incumbent ruler, or you're trying to become an independent country, that those are the types of goals we typically associate with violence. And so it's no mistake, probably nonviolent resistance doesn't work in those types of goal demands. And then the third thing that was on my mind was actually emerging from a publication by a colleague of mine named Max Abrams, who wrote this pretty influential article in the journal International Security in 2006. It's called Why Terrorism Does Not Work. And what Max does is he looks at all of the different documented terrorist groups that were around at the time, and he looks at how many of them had actually achieved what they said they wanted. And he said that about 7% of the time, these groups were succeeding in their goals, in their own stated goals. And then in the end of his article, he asks the question, if terrorism is so ineffective, then why do we see it so much? And he says that it's just 7% effectiveness, it's probably more effective than nonviolent protest would be. So this is the intellectual environment that I was coming to this workshop with, that my expectation is that nonviolent protest is one of the least effective methods of waging conflict. So, as I mentioned, Maria Stefan kind of asked me if I was willing to be a little curious and collect some data on whether nonviolent or violent resistance could be more effective. And for the next 2 years, we collected data on all known nonviolent and violent campaigns from 1900 to 2006 that were achieving these very hard demands: the removal of an incumbent leader, territorial secession, or the expulsion of a foreign military occupation. So I started with the Correlates of War data set. Raise your hand if you've heard of the Correlates of War data set. All right, there's one or two fellow nerds in the audience. I see you, I appreciate you. The Correlates of War data set is, if you go to that, you can Google it, and if you want to know whether there was a war, but like from 1500 on, you can find it in the Correlates of War data set. We measure that stuff. We've got it on the books. We know how many people died, troops at least. We know, who won and who lost, who initiated it. We know which countries it was between. We know all kinds of stuff about these violent conflicts. And so what I did is I took all of the cases that were intrastate conflicts, those that were trying to unseat incumbent leaders or create new territories, and set those aside. Now, the Correlates of War data set only includes violent conflicts where there are at least 1,000 battle deaths. So then what I tried to do is look for the correlates of nonviolent conflict data set. And you've never heard of it, any of you, because it doesn't exist. So for the next 2 years, Maria and I basically collected data from the ground up, trying to look through historical archives, government documents, case histories of different countries, and episodes of social protest, and polling experts from around the world as to whether we'd fully included the full range of known campaigns. And what we did was we applied a very strict inclusion criteria that was very similar to Correlates of War. So we only looked at cases where there were at least 1,000 observed participants. They were already kind of large-scale, mature campaigns. And we only looked at the cases where they were trying to overthrow a dictator, basically, or they were trying to become an independent country. The reason is because we wanted to be comparing apples to apples, and we wanted to get the most analogous cases to those that we observed with the violent insurgencies that were in the data set. At the end of this exercise, we had 323 cases, and we had to evaluate whether they succeeded or failed. Again, we used a very strict criterion to evaluate this. We looked at whether the outcome that the campaign sought to achieve occurred within a year of the end of its activities, which is a pretty short time frame, actually, for most political events. And we looked at whether the campaign had a decided impact on that outcome. So in other words, if a leader dies of a heart attack in office, that doesn't count. They may have had an impact on that, but it's arguable, so we didn't include those as successes. And we only looked at 100% territorial independence, not de facto autonomy. So what we're looking at is a pretty strict criteria for success. We then circulated the database among experts and asked them to evaluate our cases to make sure that we were right on the money. Now, the reason I take such pains to explain this all to you is because the findings that we came up with are pretty important, and they blow a lot of everybody's preconceived notions out of the water. So I want to make sure that you understand kind of what the limits are of this argument. What we found is that when we look back at this full range of cases from 1900 to 2006, the nonviolent campaigns were succeeding more than twice as often as the violent ones. They were also achieving significant concessions, that is, forcing free and fair elections in a dictatorship or becoming territorially autonomous, short of full independence, more than twice as often as the violent insurgencies. And the violent campaigns were failing more than twice as often as the nonviolent ones. Not only that, but get this, this trend is actually increasing quite a lot over time, such that in the past 40 years, we're seeing that nonviolent resistance is becoming increasingly effective, and that violent rebellion is becoming an increasingly ineffective enterprise. So for a person like me, this is the question. Why is nonviolent resistance outperforming violent resistance by such a dramatic extent? And when we drilled down into the data, what we actually found is that the quantity and the quality of participation is what distinguishes nonviolent campaigns from violent ones. In fact, if any of you are familiar with the Syrian conflict, this is actually a pro-Assad demonstration that was happening in the spring of 2001, just as a side note. But what we found is that participation rates really matter. And what sets nonviolent campaigns aside from violent ones is that they are huge. They tend to be huge, and they tend to be very broad-based. And the size of a campaign really impacts its ultimate outcome. So take a look at this slide. What this is showing on this axis is the logged participants per 1,000 population. You cannot interpret that directly because it's a logarithmic value. But this is looking at the probability of success. So you can see that as we increase the proportion of the population that's participating, there's a very distinct positive slope, indicating that there's a strong positive correlation between participation and success. This is for all campaigns, not just nonviolent ones. But here's the thing. Once you get up to about this level of participation, you're looking at almost all nonviolent campaigns above that. In fact, there are no campaigns in our data set that achieved the sustained participation of more than 3.5% of the population without being nonviolent. In other words, nonviolent campaigns somehow, for some reason, are able to achieve a much larger proportion of active participation among the population. And we argue that this is probably for 4 reasons, maybe more reasons than this, but there are at least 4. The first is that there's simply a lower physical barrier to participating in a nonviolent campaign. So I've already mentioned that you have a ton of different techniques of nonviolent action at your disposal. One of these techniques is like sitting at home on your couch for 3 days. Now, you don't have to be young, physically agile, and athletic to sit on your couch for 3 days. Yet, in some contexts, when people collectively do that, it grinds a country to a halt in a way that forces the incumbent regime to accommodate their demands. Armed action actually does require some degree of physical commitment. And in fact, I sometimes mention that, just as an example of this, that I was in ROTC when I was in college, and I was in it for a really short time because I really liked the, like map reading and shooting at the range and stuff and rappelling off buildings, but I really didn't like getting up at 4 in the morning and running until I vomited. Like it wasn't compatible with my college life. And so I actually totally quit ROTC and did something else. But it just demonstrates that if you're gonna be any good at organized armed activity, you generally have to make some physical sacrifices, which, a vast majority of the population actually don't wanna do. So that in itself will sometimes limit the ability of people with disabilities, elderly people, children, and in many contexts, women, from participating in this type of activity. There are also lower commitment barriers, and by that I don't mean commitment to the cause. I mean barriers to entry and barriers to exit. So for armed groups, a lot of people generally aren't going to be so-called casual insurgents. Once the decision is made to engage in armed activity, it's usually the case that people will try to join a group that is engaged in armed activity because now that's where they get their protection. They can't get it from the state, they've committed a violent crime. And so once you're in the group, then you have to demonstrate your loyalty to the group by doing more armed actions. And then once you're in, it's really hard to get out because you've done the armed actions. So there is a high barrier to entry and exit from armed groups. For nonviolent campaigns, there isn't so much this barrier to entry. People can casually participate. They don't have to quit their day job. They don't have to necessarily leave their family behind. It may create social strain in the family, but they don't necessarily have to completely alter their lifestyle and make choices that they can't walk back from by engaging in nonviolent conflict. The third lower barrier to participation is a lower informational barrier. So the example I use to demonstrate this is the notion of the problem that armed groups always have this communication problem, which is that they're always trying to overrepresent their size and everyone knows it. So the only way that an armed group can show how powerful and big it is to do armed actions in very high-profile ways. But everybody knows that when that bomb goes off, it could have been set off by 6 people, not 6,000. And that when you're joining that armed group, you don't know whether when you show up at the secret location that you've been told to go to, whether you're gonna find 6 people or 6,000 people. Now, for nonviolent campaigns, there are certain techniques that are deliberately meant to almost trick people into thinking that the campaign is bigger than it is. People will sometimes use optical illusions by concentrating a relatively small number of people, 30 or so, in an alleyway, and it looks like 100 people. Now, if you're like me, total coward, I'm gonna be like in my apartment at 8 o'clock, and somebody will come to me and say, we're gonna have a demonstration down the street tonight, I hope you can make it, it's gonna happen at 8:30. Now, I'm not the person who's showing up at 7:29 in the square to check out the demonstration. I'm the person who shows up at 9:30, or maybe even just looks out my window and sees how many people are congregating there. And if there are 16 people and it's the usual suspects, I'm gonna steer clear. But if there's a few hundred people or a few thousand people, it looks like a party, I'm joining in. And it turns out that a lot of human beings are this way. We have cognitive processes that actually signal to us when there are safety in numbers. And safety in numbers is like one of the key points about the strategic effectiveness of nonviolent campaigns. And then the last lower barrier to participation is the lower cognitive barrier to participation. Now, lots of different studies around the world have shown that generally human beings are more willing to die than to kill. And in fact, we don't really, there's still a lot of controversy about why that's the case, but we just know that there are all kinds of inhibitors in our brains that are, the things that are preventing me from flying off the stage and throttling you all right now. Things like moral inhibitions, things like, different types of social norms and social cues and habits that are developed in my brain that suppress the instinct to engage in offensive violence. Now, we all have those to differing degrees. Some people have them more than others. But the bottom line is that, people don't have to unlearn that to engage in nonviolent conflict. And a lot of people have to unlearn that to engage in violent conflict. And that's just another barrier to participation. So why does participation matter so much? Now, it doesn't matter as much that like 100,000 or 200,000 or 1 million people hit the streets. It matters what that produces, the chain reaction that it produces within the opponent. And the general model of civil resistance that's advocated by people like Gene Sharp and even a precursor to him, Hannah Arendt, and her notion about power, is that no regime is monolithic. No regime's power is permanent. It has to be constantly replenished and rejuvenated, and that it's based entirely on obedience and consent rather than on force. Now, this is actually kind of a revolutionary idea because most political scientists say, well, power is based on the monopoly on the use of force. And they're saying, no, it's actually based on the monopoly on legitimacy and consent. And when people start to disobey, and they start to openly disobey, the people on whom the regime relies as agents of its power might pull away from it. So we think about these in terms of these so-called pillars of support. Pillars of support are people like those who reside in the security forces, economic elites, business elites, educational elites, state media, religious authorities, people in the society who prop up the leader or legitimize the leader. Now, when you start getting massive numbers of civilians that are mobilizing, and they are cutting across all kinds of different social cleavages, that might start to activate discomfort in the people who reside in these pillars of support. And by discomfort, I mean a reevaluation of whether it's in their long-term interest to continue obeying the authorities, or whether it's time for them to step aside. So let me give you an example of this. There's kind of a well-known documentary called Bringing Down a Dictator that's about a Serbian youth movement that helped to organize a coalition of actors that ended up removing Slobodan Milosevic from power in Serbia. Now, in this film, there's a really crucial turning point in this campaign where all these hundreds of thousands of people are amassing in Belgrade, in this main square. They're coming from all over the country. And there's this really important moment there where you see a shift in the security forces, that they're no longer willing to shoot into the crowd, that they're no longer willing to defend the blockades that they set up. And some of them are asked why. And they say, I knew my kids would be in the crowd. Or I knew my cousin would be in the crowd. Or I didn't want to be on TV and have my wife see me shoot somebody in the face because then I was not going to, be very popular at home. And things like that, these sort of micro relationships in society that are very difficult for us to observe, but we know are there. And that when the pressure comes from below, that they can activate those points of leverage, and then all of a sudden you see people making decisions based on, whether their wife is comfortable in the shopping mall, rather than, that they want to continue supporting the dear leader. So this is the hypothesis. Maria and I tested it. Turns out it's like right on the money. We only looked at security force defections. We didn't look at economic elites or business elites or educational elites. But we looked at when security forces defected. That means they disobeyed orders outright, or they started to call in sick to work en masse in a way that was kind of like obvious that they weren't just doing it because they were sick. And what we found here is that as participation size increases for violent campaigns, there is kind of a steady increase, but it's not substantial. And violent campaigns never really move past this level of about under 30% likelihood of creating security force defections. And that's even in the largest violent campaigns. So the biggest ones ever are still pretty unlikely to produce these shifts. Now, if you take a look at the nonviolent campaigns, as they get very large, you can see that they're starting to get up into the doubling of likelihood of creating those security force defections compared with the violent ones. Now, this is why the size of the campaign matters, because the bigger it is, the more credible the demonstration to these erstwhile elites that it's not in their future interest to continue obeying their authorities. So, people often ask about repression. Do nonviolent campaigns work under these severe repressive circumstances? Well, we find that they do. There is a reduction in the effectiveness, but that relative to violent campaigns, the nonviolent ones are still outperforming them by over 2-to-1 margin. And so this is another puzzle. Why would this be the case? And we think there are basically two reasons. The first is that there's a general pattern that when governments crack down on unarmed protesters, there's more likely to be a backfiring of that repression. Backfiring is a process where the intended outcome of the repression isn't what happens. Instead, the opposite happens. So if you're shooting at 100,000 people one day, the next day 200,000 people turn out because they're so angry at what you did. That would be backfire. And in fact, what we find is a generalized pattern that when regimes crack down on these unarmed people, it's more likely that you'll have that resurgence of mobilization than if they crack down against violent rebels, which for one reason or another seems to be okay with people. And then the second reason is because repression, and I think this one may be arguably more important, repression can become increasingly unsustainable over time when you have a very large nonviolent movement. And here's the reason. Because as I mentioned, there are all these different methods of nonviolent action, and you can think about them as being grouped into two categories. One, methods of concentration, and the other, methods of dispersion. Concentration are methods where people come together in a particular space. They assemble mass. They try to disrupt the system. And these are the ones you see on TV and that you see on the front page of the news because they're very visually impressive. Now, the thing is, they're visually impressive, and they can often bring more people out into the movement, but they're very dangerous, especially if you're doing them day after day after day, when all of a sudden it becomes very easy for the opponent to just surround the movement with tanks and start shooting or rounding people up. So when a movement is very large, it has at its disposal methods of dispersion. Dispersion is when you stay away from places you are expected to go, like this general strike, which, these guys, they have to get paid for that, right? So it's stretching out the costs of repression, but they're not doing anything. They're just getting paid, and they might even be paid overtime because there was a demonstration announced, and they showed up to control it, but instead of people being there, they're just standing there alone in the streets. That's going to keep people very safe, but it's also going to be highly disruptive and costly for the other side. And in fact, one of the best illustrations of this is the Iranian Revolution, the one from 1977 to 79, where there was the sort of apex of it was called the 100 Days Revolution. The first 90 or so days were mostly these methods of concentration, people in the streets, demonstrations, funeral processions, rallies, things like this. And there was sniper fire, and there were people getting mowed down in the streets by live ammunition, left and right. There were thousands of casualties. But then what happened is in the final days, the oil workers in the countryside agreed to go on strike, and they did a stay-at-home demonstration combined with that. So then the security forces had to go door to door, home to home, and pull people back out on the streets. They marched to the oil fields, and then they worked at half pace. And then they did it the next day again. The security forces go door to door, they pull people back out in the streets, march them down in the streets, they work at half pace at the oil fields. Now, after 3 or 4 days of this, security forces stopped showing up to work in the morning. They were too uncomfortable going into people's homes, and they thought, which they inaccurately thought, but they thought that they weren't going to get paid for it because the oil wells weren't churning, and they thought that the regime was short on reserves. In fact, it wasn't, but that's totally beside the point. And within a few days, the Shah fled the country. Some people want to know whether campaigns can succeed without external support. Well, we looked at external support as just material support from a foreign state, and we found that certainly for armed campaigns, it's an advantage. It's actually the one thing that tends to increase their chances of success. Even armed campaigns that receive foreign support, though, have a lower chance of success than unarmed campaigns that don't. That's something interesting to think about. But actually what ends up happening is we looked at nonviolent campaigns, and we didn't see a significant impact one way or another. In other words, it doesn't seem to help the campaigns, and it doesn't seem to hurt the campaigns. We use a very limited measure. We just looked at direct material aid instead of things like diplomatic support and so forth. And in some recent research I've done, I've actually found that when a sponsor of a state removes its support for the regime, that can be very important. So this is like President Reagan telling Ferdinand Marcos that the US is not going to back up the Philippines government anymore during the People Power movement. That actually, when that happens, it proves to be fairly influential. So why does it matter? I think there are three reasons besides just the fact that we do observe this dramatic difference in the short-term success rates of these campaigns. We also tend to observe, I think, fewer casualties in the prosecution of nonviolent campaigns relative to their violent counterparts. Now, these nonviolent campaigns are rarely casualty-free. Almost all the cases that we look at, there were deaths involved. There were people who were rising up against pretty brutal opponents, and they were doing very risky action. So there are deaths for sure. But the thing is that the repression itself is more likely to create dilemmas within that, those pillars of support when that happens. Whereas, as I've said, for armed campaigns, it's not. In fact, in his book, Final Solutions, Ben Valentino, a political scientist at Dartmouth College, found that, in fact, the most common types of mass atrocities in the 20th century are not your Hitlers or your Pol Pots. Instead, there are people in governments who are facing an armed revolution or armed insurgency, and they use scorched earth counterinsurgency methods where they target civilians who they fear are supporting the insurgents as a way to defeat the insurgents. It's very much similar to what we're seeing in Syria today. Scorched earth campaigns of counterinsurgency are very common, and they're the most common source of mass atrocity that we know of. The second reason why we should care is that in the longer term, we end up with more procedurally democratic countries as a consequence of nonviolent campaigns. Now, what this is showing here is the polity scale between -10 and +10. It's a 21-point scale that a lot of political scientists use to evaluate the level of political free competition, institutional constraints on the government, like separation of powers and the like. And what we actually find is that, this higher end means it's more democratic, the lower end means it's like a totalitarian regime. And what we measured here on this side is the probability that a country will be a democracy that is a +6 or higher on this scale within just 5 years of the end of the campaign. Now, most comparative politics scholars will tell you that a democratic consolidation takes about 25 years. So that's a very strict timeline. Yet what we find is that for countries that were already democratic, that face a violent campaign, only about less than 50% of them stay democratic 5 years later. In other words, violent insurgency degrades democracy. And for those that are undemocratic during the violent campaign, there's almost no chance that they become democratic after. This is whether the campaign succeeds or fails, by the way. Then for violent campaigns, we see that there's a much more linear effect on the probability that the country will be a democracy 5 years after. It's already double the probability compared with violent insurgencies at the least free levels. And then as the country during the campaign is more democratic, it's almost unheard of that those countries will not be democratic after they face a nonviolent campaign. And so a lot of people would wonder, why is that a case? Why is something so disruptive, civil resistance, leading to these more democratic outcomes? And I think that we can look to good old Bob Putnam for part of the answer for that. Robert Putnam wrote this book called Making Democracy Work, and then he wrote another version called Bowling Alone. And his argument is that when people engage in a high degree of associational life in civil society, that this actually increases the level at which elected leaders feel responsive to their populations. And so if you think about civil society or associational life as being an important predictor of democracy, then civil resistance is almost like associational life but on steroids, because it's engaged in a very high-risk set of collaborative projects where people are experiencing conflict resolution using nonviolent means, and it's much more likely to be institutionalized after the fact. This is a similar dynamic with regard to the likelihood that these countries will revert to civil war. So we looked at whether they are likely to do that within 10 years of the end of the campaign. Again, nonviolent campaigns are about 15% less likely to relapse into civil war within 10 years. And it's not a huge substantive effect, but I'd rather live in the country that had the less likelihood of relapse into civil war. So with that said, I'll just end with a couple of observations. To me, this research has really brought up a couple of important questions. First of all, about the nature of power. So I was one of those people that was classically trained in political science and not just believed, but would fully insist that power flows from the barrel of a gun. And instead, I think what this research is asking us to look at is the question of whether power actually flows from legitimacy and the agency and willingness of people to voluntarily obey when they otherwise wouldn't. The second thing that it does is it asks us to look at the role of civilians in conflict. So many of you will probably come across readings on civil war and international intervention and things like that in your studies here. And what I notice about this literature is it typically looks at civilians as either victims or resources to loot. But it doesn't look at civilians as active agents of their own destiny. And I think that this research asks us to look at that in a serious way. And then the third thing that it asks us to look at is this overall structure and agency debate. One thing I wasn't able to demonstrate with you today because of time constraints is that these results hold up regardless of what kind of regime type we're talking about, regardless of the decade, regardless of the region of the world, which might be a proxy for underlying culture, and all kinds of different structural or environmental conditions that a lot of scholars would say completely preclude even the option of nonviolent resistance, much less its success. And we find that that's not the case, that none of those structural factors predetermine the outcome of these cases, which suggests that people are actually choosing what they want to do. That's something that political scientists don't generally deal with very well. And then for policymakers, there are a couple of really important questions. The first is, whom do you support? Well, if it's true that not only is armed rebellion becoming less effective over time, but also that it generally ushers in periods of tremendous instability, lack of democracy, and a huge cost in human life, it's probably not a good idea to continue supporting armed rebel groups. That said, our research also suggests that supporting nonviolent movements might not do much for them either. This might be because it could directly undermine their local legitimacy, or it could just create classic free rider problems, where when certain people in the group are getting rich, the rest of the people don't want to risk their neck for the process. And so what it suggests is for us to get a little more creative about the ways in which we actually do lend our support, if at all, to people around the world who are trying to expand their rights. And for me, part of the solution here is looking at the more non-traditional civilian-led instruments. That is just putting people in contact with other people who've been there before, that might be able to share with them some of the lessons they learned, some of the skills that they developed in order to apply that to their own circumstances. So if there are 3 takeaway points, the first one is that nonviolent resistance has been surprisingly effective compared with armed insurgency. Second, that this is true even in circumstances where we would expect nonviolent resistance to not even emerge, much less succeed. And then third, that the way that you fight largely influences how you rule when you win. And that if we are indeed trying to produce societies in which people's rights are respected, that people are able to enjoy relative levels of peace and improvements at least, not perfection, but improvements in political freedoms, then it seems to me that this is a method of conflict that we should know much more about. So with that, I will entertain your questions and leave you with all my details. Thank you.